as most listeners know, the new Congress is back in town in Washington, D.C., and I forgot my ticker tape. Shame on me. But here to talk to us now about the new Congress and, of course, Senate, both run by the Republicans, convening and what's in store for them under the incoming president is Kellie Mejdrich. Kellie is a reporter with CQ Roll Call. She covers budget and appropriations, as well as, I guess, all related stories, all things congressional related to those topics. So, Kellie, first of all, thanks for coming on the program.
Glad to be here, Richard. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, absolutely. And so tell us, we've already seen a few days worth of the new Congress at work. What have we seen? People have heard, I think, most of all about the ethics story. So let's start with that. What was the takeaway in your mind from the ethics story? What happened, and why do you think it happened?
Sure. That was quite the whirlwind to kick off the 115th Congress. We had a late night closed door meeting in a House office building to kind of hash out amendments for rules that Republicans will use in the House to govern the 115th Congress in their chamber. And there was a push to modify this independent ethics committee. Lawmakers had been complaining that this committee allowed anonymous tips to open investigations on lawmakers, and it was very burdensome. But that backfired almost immediately. The next day, the headlines in BBC and the New York Times were criticizing Republican lawmakers for implementing this change. And then a tweet on Twitter from President-elect Donald Trump kind of sealed the deal of it was shining kind of a negative light on the Republicans in Congress right at the start. So Republicans, managed to quickly change the amendment package they had on these rules and eliminated that provision. And so it was a bit of a rocky start for Republicans in Congress, who really wanted to project unity in their party as they kick off a Republican-controlled House, Senate, and White House. But there's a lot of organization going on at the top of this Congress, punctuated by really early action on a budget resolution to try to repeal President Barack Obama's signature health care law. That happened, just a matter of days after this rules package. It's just been nonstop news here up on the Capitol.
Yeah, I know, and I definitely want to get to the Obamacare issue and a couple others as well. But just to close the loop on the ethics story, so they wanted to make this move to basically weaken ethics oversight. That's how it was widely interpreted anyway. And some people credited the reversal to Donald Trump. What Donald Trump tweeted specifically was basically that it was a good idea. He didn't say he was opposed to it, but he said. He said, let's not do it.
Essentially, it was distracting,
and not the first thing to do. But a lot of people feel that call-ins did a lot, that a lot of constituent pressure had a lot to do with that. So, okay, they pivoted after about a day or so, right? And they started concentrating on Obamacare. And tell us about that, because I think the machinations around the idea of repealing Obamacare are confusing. They've talked about procedural issues and budget and resolutions, which have different rules and other ways to repeal Obamacare. So tell us a little bit about what they mean by repealing Obamacare, what it really sounds like they're doing, and how the procedural issues fit into that.
It's a very complicated process, and it's one that, listeners might be interested to know that Democrats in Congress utilized the same type of process to implement the 2010 healthcare law. When they lost, the ability to use the regular lawmaking process, they seized on this budget process. Because remember, in the Senate, you need to have 60 votes to move forward most legislation. And Republicans only have 52 members in their majority in the chamber. And so the only way to really get legislation through without Democratic support, and of course Democrats are united against repealing this law, is to use the budget process, which only requires a simple majority vote. So because lawmakers didn't finish last year's spending business, they actually have a leg up on being able to move forward with this repeal process. So they're using
By embedding it in the other budgetary measures, because I know it has to have an impact on the financial outlook of the government before they can use this process. But somehow, I guess if they can embed it with their other unfinished budget measures, that gets easier for them. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, so typically what would have happened at the end of last year, I mean, it doesn't always happen, but they were supposed to finish up what's called like the fiscal 2017 spending season. But because they didn't do that and they kind of held over spending decisions into the following year, this was at the Trump transition team's request, by the way, congressional leaders tell me. That meant that they could go back and alter the budget blueprint for that spending season. And so normally the budget process wouldn't get into gear until the spring or late spring after the submission of the president's budget. But because they have this old budget, they can use that and now move that to the president. And now the budget resolution is it's a document that the president doesn't sign. But if the Senate and House both agree on the same resolution, and they include what's called reconciliation instructions, I know that's just a mouthful, but reconciliation is basically a process that unlocks a series of bills for the president to later sign that can implement the type of tax and spending policies that are needed to really break down major portions of this law. Now, that's not going to be the complete repeal of Obamacare. They can't repeal the entire law using that process, but they can repeal a major portion of it. And then those types of bills could be signed into law sometime this year. So, you know, it would have to go through a lot of the tax writing committees and the health policy committees. But again, because they decided not to finish spending business that began with President Barack Obama's budget, it's now giving President-elect Donald Trump a quicker crack at being able to repeal the law. Now, this is raising great concern among, Democrats and also some moderate Republicans who are worried that a quick repeal of the law without an adequate replacement could somehow trigger the healthcare market into disruption. It could strip coverage from millions of Americans who are using the system, who have nothing left. Trump transition officials, as well as Republicans in Congress, assert that there will be some type of two-track transition, two-track process, whereby there's a cushion for those people who are currently utilizing the law that's in place.
Sure it does. And again, we're talking with Kellie Mejdrich of CQ Roll Call about the new Congress. It's complicated, but it makes sense. And I think it's important that people understand it. Now, when Obamacare was first passed in 2010, many of its core provisions took several years to kick in for a variety of reasons, including the political sensitivity of the individual mandate and so on.
Absolutely.
So now we have, in effect, the Republicans doing the mirror image of that. After voting on repealing it some 40 times or whatever it is, now that they have the power to repeal it, it's as if some of them, at least, are saying, potentially including Trump, but certainly some of the Republicans in the Senate and House who see the potential unpopularity or downside say, well, wait a minute, not so fast. So it's getting, if we just repeal it, we're going to get in trouble. So what are they offering? So as you said, Kellie Mejdrich, they're talking about, well, we'll do a two-track thing where we're repealing it, but we're also working on a replacement. But for the life of me, and I have genuinely tried to look with an open mind, I can't figure out what they think is their replacement.
And they don't really fully know yet what the replacement is. That has been the message coming from, Vice President-elect Mike Pence came to Capitol Hill this week and talked to reporters alongside House Speaker Paul Ryan and, the rest of Republican House leadership, and said, that this is something that they're working on that's still in process, but they believe that the election has really given a mandate from the voters to repeal this law as soon as possible and to provide relief, as they say, immediately. Now, again, because the reconciliation process allows them to basically ram through this repeal without the consent of any Democrats, it does present a potentially politically complicated problem that Democrats faced after they implemented the 2010 healthcare law. That is, okay, if you basically strip away a program or completely change a huge entitlement program without the consent of anyone else on the other side, how do you go about rebuilding that in a way that is consensus-based?
Just to interrupt you for a second, Kelly.
Yeah.
And it's what another Republican, Colin Powell, used to call the Pottery Barn rule. If you break it, you buy it. That they're going to own it from now on. And if it leads to a disaster with millions of people losing coverage and healthcare becoming even less affordable than it already is, that's their problem now. So,
that shouldn't be lost on listeners, because Democrats definitely know that politically they're kind of covered a little bit from the way that this process is going on. The Republicans are going to have to own dismantling the ACA. And then the question is, are Democrats going to come to the table? Now, the Republicans think that politically they're not going to not be able to. But Democrats are saying, you guys have to come up with a replacement if you're going to tear the law apart.
Which to me, and I'll criticize Democrats when they need criticizing, to me that seems like a not unreasonable position. But Kelly, before we go, I definitely want to cover the issue of Social Security and Medicare too, because
absolutely.
Trump, now this to me, it seems is going to be big in this Congress. Trump ran as a different kind of Republican, as he distinguished himself from the other 16 original presidential candidates by saying, I won't cut Medicare, I won't cut your Social Security, I disagree with these guys who want to do it. But all the leadership in the House and Senate, Republican leadership, have been on record with plans that, in my opinion, cut Medicare, cut Social Security. They want to raise the Medicare eligibility age. They want to decrease Social Security benefits, raise the Social Security eligibility age even more. Trump's pick for Health and Human Services is on record as backing these ideas, and much more. So we have a guy who's basically surrounded and has surrounded himself by fellow Republicans who want to cut these programs. Any inklings yet, any feedback from Congress on whether they plan, for example, Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, plans to act on his own proposals for Medicare, or whether the House plans to move, or Senate plans to move on Republican plans to cut Social Security as well?
I mean, and that's a big question, and it's also a question that needs to take into account that the Affordable Care Act made changes to Medicare.
Right.
And so if they're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, it has a dramatic effect on the insolvency of Medicare's Part A trust fund, for example. I mean, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is really, a kind of a budget-focused, deficit hawk group in Washington, they just put out a report today that shows that they claim that if the full ACA is repealed, that means by 2021, the Medicare Part A trust fund balance is going to go insolvent. And so under the current law, that's through 2026. I mean, that's 5 years. But the bottom line is that Social Security and Medicare trust funds are on an unsustainable path. And so when President-elect Donald Trump says he's not going to modify those, I mean, he can say that on the campaign trail, but the lawmakers in Congress are grappling with a serious fiscal problem. And that how do you...
Yeah,
go ahead.
I have to say, Kelly, I have a little different take on that, because I used to work in that field of health economics and pension and benefits. And I think that it's true that Social Security in the long run, by the 2030s, has got to either come up with more revenue or cut benefits. And these Republicans are not going to increase revenues. I think Medicare does have a cost problem, but I one of the things that I've been a critic in many ways of the Affordable Care Act, but it does have some cost control measures in it, measures that some of the Republicans, like Tom Price, the incoming Health and Human Services Secretary, if he's confirmed, are against. So
absolutely.
So I think these guys are kind of between a rock and a hard place because they, like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, preach deficit reduction when it's a program they don't like. But here, what they want to do is going to make that problem even worse. So how do they move forward unless they do what they did in previous decades, which is just forget about deficits once they get into power?
And that was a huge source of outrage from Democrats in the Senate, who tried to fight against, but, failed to stop procedural advancement of the first step in this budget process to repealing the law that occurred this week. Some of your listeners might have seen the Bernie Sanders speech on the floor where he put up Donald Trump's tweet saying that he wouldn't touch Social Security and Medicare. Oddly, there were some alliances on the Republican side, not too many, but Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky also took to the floor to cry out against approving a budget that, creates what many people estimate is like a $1 trillion hole in the federal deficit. And so, this deficits argument is also kind of mutating on Capitol Hill because it's really hard to square the repeal of the Affordable Care Act with entitlement reform for Social Security and Medicare when the president-elect says he doesn't want to change anything about that. So that is going to be a major developing story on Capitol Hill, and it's going to be one that becomes a key issue as lawmakers have committed to this very vigorous budget process. We're not just going to have the budget that was worked on this week, but we're also going to have the fiscal 2018 budget, which is probably going to come sometime in the late spring after they finish up last year's spending work. So, this is going to be something that Republicans are going to have to grapple with, and Democrats are definitely going to hold their feet to the fire, as are some very conservative deficit hawks on the Republican side.
Well, I don't want to say it's going to be fun to watch because a lot of people's well-being is at stake, but it's going to be fun to watch. So, Kellie Mejdrich, Budget and Appropriations Reporter for CQ Roll Call, thanks for covering this story and thanks for coming on the program and talking about it.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
And same here.